Have you ever wondered how a single person, someone completely outside the military world, could do something so absurd that it would disrupt an entire airstrike? Now, let's go back to the moment when it all began. It was supposed to be just another day of war, another one of those precise attacks the enemy carried out without mercy, destroying barracks, hospitals, entire villages. Planes appeared on the horizon like gigantic shadows, devouring the sun, and the sound of the engines made the ground vibrate as if the earth wanted to escape. Soldiers shouted orders that no one could hear. Children ran to makeshift hiding places, and the smell of dust mixed with gunpowder seemed to announce death even before it arrived. And it was arriving quickly. The bombs began to fall like hammers from the sky, opening craters, raising columns of smoke, destroying lives. In the midst of this inferno, an entire platoon was trapped between two explosions, without shelter, without an escape route, condemned to turn to smoke in the next dive of the bombers. A sergeant, his face bloodied and his arm broken, could only look up. He saw the enemy lining up the final attack. There were no guns pointed, no anti-aircraft defense, nothing that could save them. They were dead, and they knew it. It was a matter of seconds. The sky turned white for a moment. The sound disappeared. Everything seemed to slow down. A younger soldier fell to his knees, praying for a miracle, while the commander simply closed his eyes, accepting his fate. And then something happened that no one expected. A sudden, almost imperceptible change, but enough to save hundreds of lives. A mistake in the alignment of the planes, an abrupt deviation, a hesitation that made no sense. The attack that should have been perfect simply failed. The bombs fell too far, the dives lost precision, the pilots became confused. Suddenly, everyone realized there was something down there that the planes weren't understanding. And here's what no one would have imagined, not even in 1,000 years. Because at that moment, although no one knew it, a carpenter, yes, a man from a workshop, a woodworker, a man of nails and saws, had just done the most improbable thing in the war. Something so absurd that even the generals would have said, impossible. And yet, it worked. The air raid that would have killed them all was interrupted by an idea so simple, so outside military logic, so unbelievable, that you'll swear it's fiction. But it's not. And when you find out what this man did, you'll understand why even today there are people who call it the most improbable trick of the entire war. And that's just the beginning. Want to know who this man was and how he did the impossible? Then take a deep breath, because the next chapter will show you what no one ever imagined a simple carpenter could do. What would you do if you discovered that a simple idea, created by an ordinary man, managed to stop an entire air raid at the height of war? Before continuing this amazing story, please subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment below what city and country you're watching from. This helps me know how far these stories are reaching and to bring you even more content that truly captivates you. He wasn't a soldier. He didn't wear a uniform. He didn't carry medals on his chest, and he had never fired a weapon. In fact, the last thing anyone would imagine is that a man like him could have any impact on a war of that scale. His name was Elias Marcondes, a carpenter with calloused hands, broad shoulders, and a serene gaze, the kind of man who spoke little, worked hard, and bore the marks of a life of effort, not violence. He lived for wood, the smell of sawdust, the steady sound of the planer, the vibration of the blade cutting through old fibers. There, in the workshop, was where he felt safe. But war never respects safety, routine, or simplicity. When the first bombings began, Elias was still trying to salvage furniture from families who had lost entire homes. He carried broken tables, torn-off doors, charred beams, and rebuilt everything with the patience of someone who believes that life can be pieced back together, piece by piece. But it didn't take long for him to realize that there wasn't enough wood in the world to rebuild what the war destroyed in minutes, and that's how he found himself carrying tools into an improvised military camp, where nothing made sense to a man, accustomed to silence, precision, and order. Elias didn't belong there. Soldiers running back and forth, people shouting orders he didn't understand, sirens that never stopped, and a constant air of urgency that made his chest tighten. He felt his heart pounding as if out of rhythm, not from fear of death, but from fear of being useless in there. He wasn't a hero. He was a worker, a craftsman. But even so, he insisted on helping. He nailed reinforcements to tents, built ammunition crates, repaired makeshift doors so that the cold of the early morning wouldn't punish the exhausted soldiers. It was all he could do. However, as the conflict progressed, Elias noticed something that unsettled him. The bombings were becoming increasingly precise, almost surgical. He saw soldiers looking at the sky with a mixture of anger, despair, and resignation. Some cursed, others prayed, others simply stood motionless, waiting for the worst. Elias observed everything quietly, trying to understand the pattern of destruction. It wasn't just the people's pain, it was the rationale behind the violence. He studied, albeit unknowingly, the rhythm of the machines, the sounds of the engines, the behavior of the shadows cast on the ground. And with each attack, something inside him ached deeply. He had never been a man of war, but he was a man of things that break. And for Elias, each bomb that fell was like a ruined work of art, a piece of the world destroyed in a brutal blow, without care, without any intention of rebuilding. He felt a silent rage, not the explosive rage of young soldiers, but a deep, contained fury, like the crack of an ancient piece of wood about to break. He felt powerless, and, at the same time, uneasy, as if something were wrong with that balance between attack and defense. On the most difficult nights, when the camp was shrouded in a heavy silence, Elias would sit alone at his small, makeshift table, holding pieces of wood as if they were extensions of his own story. He would spend hours carving small pieces, a wing, a pedestal, a support, without knowing exactly why. Perhaps it was a way to keep his mind at ease. Perhaps it was his way of avoiding going insane watching the world crumble around him. The curious thing was that he couldn't sleep. The noise of the planes echoed in his head, as if it were being carved into his memory. It was a kind of torment, but also a clue, because Elias, with his simple gaze and silent skill, began to notice details that no one else noticed. The roar of the engines wasn't random. There were patterns, rhythms, intervals. The planes didn't attack haphazardly. They responded to what they saw on the ground. It was on a night with a completely black sky, illuminated only by the distant flashes of explosions, that Elias finally understood what he was feeling. Sadness, fear, helplessness, and a strange intuition. He realized that somehow his eyes, trained for wood, were identifying something that the general's eyes couldn't see. It was as if, in each attack, the planes followed a reflection, a shadow, an alignment that seemed natural to those who knew structure, weight, and direction, and this began to dominate his thoughts. He walked through the camp observing everything intently, bent posts, leaning sheds, marks on the ground, lights reflecting at specific angles. While the soldiers were merely trying to survive, Elias was trying to understand, and the more he understood, the more restless he became. Deep down he felt that there was something that could be done. A trick, an interference, a break in the pattern, something simple, absurd, and that perhaps could save lives. He didn't tell anyone at that moment. He kept it to himself, like someone guarding a secret too fragile to be exposed. But the idea had already been born, and however absurd it might seem, it wouldn't leave his head until it transformed into the most improbable thing the war had ever seen. The idea was born like a spark, small, strange, even absurd. But when it emerged, Elias felt his breath catch. It was as if all the invisible pieces had finally fallen into place. He stood motionless for a few seconds, gripping a crooked beam in his hands, while the distant sounds of bombing echoed in the night. It was an uncomfortable feeling, as if he were about to do something dangerous, forbidden, and necessary. It all began with the realization of a detail that no one else noticed. The enemy planes always attacked from the same angle. They aligned themselves based on the reflection on the ground, a natural reference point that emerged during the darkest periods of the early morning, when lanterns and makeshift camp lights created long shadows and strong contrasts. For the pilots, this guided altitude and direction. For Elias, it was a predictable pattern, and what is predictable can be broken. One quiet morning, Elias walked to the edge of the camp, carrying only a small lantern, some planks, and nails. The soldiers on guard looked at him strangely but said nothing. They were already used to the Carpenter's silent habits. He had a way of walking that seemed to say, "Don't worry, I know what I'm doing," even if no one really believed it. But that night, Elias wasn't there to mend tents or reinforce crates. He was trying to outwit war machines with the thing he understood best in life: wood. He looked at the dark sky, took a deep breath, and drove the first stakes into the ground. Then he installed planks at specific angles, calculated with the instinct of someone who understands balance, weight, shadows, and reflections without needing a ruler or instructions. Little by little, he began to build simple, almost ridiculous structures: thin towers, leaning crosses, wide planks positioned as if staging a stage set. To a casual observer, it looked like the work of a man driven mad by trauma. Even the passing soldiers whispered amongst themselves, wondering what he was up to. But Elias heard none of it. In his mind, he could only visualize the planes, the trajectory, the dive, the glare of the spotlights distorting as they hit the wood. He was creating illusions, false shadows, distorted references, misleading points of alignment that, seen from above, could alter the pilot's readings. It was so simple it seemed stupid. But war is sometimes won not by force, but by invisible details. And Elias knew this without ever having read a military manual. When he finished the first phase of his makeshift construction, he climbed onto a small embankment and observed the result. It was just wooden planks tilted in different directions, capable of projecting shadows that danced on the ground in the wind. Faint lights reflected differently on each surface, creating optical illusions that would only make sense when viewed from a distance. There on the ground, it was nothing. Seen from the sky, it was a completely distorted map, a visual lie deliberately created to cause confusion. The next day, when the sun rose, soldiers passed by the strange construction laughing. One of them asked, "What's that thing going to do to the planes? Make them burst out laughing?" Elias didn't answer. The truth is, even he wasn't entirely sure. He only had a hunch, and an irritating feeling that it all might work. That afternoon, something strange began to happen. Enemy planes appeared on the horizon as usual, but this time their alignment seemed hesitant. They flew higher than normal, circled more often, before descending, and misjudged their angle of attack. The pilots, accustomed to recognizing landmarks on the ground, couldn't decipher the shadows. Everything seemed wrong. It was as if the landscape had completely changed overnight. The first attacks fell much sooner than expected, so sooner that they didn't even hit the camp. This already put the soldiers on alert. The second attacks were worse for the enemy. Bombs exploded in unpopulated areas, in empty trenches, on isolated hills. The precision that was once impeccable had now evaporated. The officers realized that something was influencing the bombings. They began to study the phenomenon, to look at maps, to review reports. But Elias didn't need any map. He already knew. He saw the shadows changing, saw the light reflecting at the exact angles, saw his absurd work functioning as predicted. Only he understood that this dance of reflections and distortions was breaking the plane's terrain reading. But the trick wasn't complete. Elias had one final step, the riskiest one. He carried new planks, longer and thinner, and positioned them in such a way as to create an even more powerful illusory effect at night, a set of intersecting shadows that, when viewed from above, would form a pattern similar to deep craters, as if the terrain were completely destroyed. This would fool even experienced pilots, who would avoid flying over areas with supposed irregularities, believing that the ground offered no reliable reference. Elijah was creating an invisible barrier against an enemy who blindly trusted his own eyes. When the next attack came, he was sitting on the ground, sweating profusely, his hands trembling. He didn't know if he had overreacted or if he had finally achieved the impossible. The planes approached, but this time something extraordinary happened. They simply avoided the entire camp. They flew away, made sharp turns, aborted the attack. It was as if they were seeing an abyss where, in deep reality, there was only solid ground and cheap wood. And it was at that moment, when the impossible became reality, that Elias realized his absurd idea had just stopped an entire attack. And that was only the beginning of what he was about to unleash in the war. After seeing the planes swerve, Elias stood still for long seconds, as if the whole world were suspended in mid-air. It was impossible to believe what had just happened. He felt his heart pounding, as if trying to escape his chest, while his eyes searched the sky for some sign that this hadn't been just a coincidence. But it wasn't. He knew. The trick had worked, not partially, not by luck, but with a precision he hadn't even imagined. And yet, Elias didn't celebrate. He sat on the ground, rested his arms on his knees and stared at the floor, as if trying to understand his own thoughts. He wasn't an engineer. He wasn't a soldier. He hadn't studied aerodynamics or bombing tactics. What he had was something else. A lifetime, observing the behavior of materials, shadows, light, and structures. When you work with wood for 40 years, you learn to see what no one else sees. You learn to understand balance, perspective, illusion, and movement. You learn to measure with your eye, to hear with your touch, to feel with silence. And that perception, that hidden mathematics, was what was making the difference there. But war leaves no time for reflection. That same night, in the distance, the sound of engines echoed again. The enemy was reorganizing the attack, correcting course, trying to regain air superiority. Trenches were reinforced, soldiers lined up, officers shouted orders, and fear spread through the camp like a cold shadow. Elias realized his trick had worked, but only temporarily. He needed to go further. He needed to transform that small victory into something bigger, something impossible to ignore. He walked alone through the night, feeling the cold wind on his face, carrying only a lantern and his tools. The ground was marked by ancient craters, and the smell of gunpowder permeated the air. As he walked, Elias began to notice things that no one else saw: the way the lantern's light created crooked lines on the ground, the shifting shadows as he moved, the reflections in the small pieces of metal scattered across the earth. Every detail became a calculation, every fragment a possibility. That's when he had his second great idea, even more absurd than the first. If the planes were guided by shadows and reflections, Elias could create a fake bombing range. Not just distort the terrain, but build a kind of illusory copy of the camp far away, using only wood, twisted metal, and lights. If the pilots believed the camp was misplaced, they would attack the wrong place, not by mistake, but because they would have been deceived by the very technique. Elias immediately began to work. He gathered planks, pieces of tree trunk, remnants of destroyed tents, broken boxes, anything that could be reused. The entire camp slept, but he couldn't close his eyes. He hammered wood until his fingers bled, dragged heavy beams until his legs trembled, adjusted every angle as if he were assembling his final masterpiece. It was like building a theatrical set to deceive furious gods flying in the sky. The night passed and Elias didn't even notice. He was so focused that time ceased to exist. When the first ray of dawn touched the ground, the fake camp was already set up, rustic, improvised, but convincing from above. The shadows cast by the structures were almost identical to real shadows. The makeshift towers imitated military tents. The assembled crates created the illusion of vehicles, and the small reflections generated by pieces of metal imitating extinguished campfires completed the deception. When the soldiers woke up and saw that, they were confused. Some laughed, others thought Elijah had finally gone mad. Even one of the officers approached, crossed his arms and asked, "What is this place? A museum of rubble?" Elijah didn't answer. He just looked up at the sky, as if waiting for confirmation. And it came. Late in the morning, the dreaded sound appeared. Heavy engines, a growing hum, giant shadows circling above. The soldiers rushed to defensive positions, but Elias stood still, watching. He wanted to know if the trick would really work, or if it was all just an illusion created by his own hope. The planes approached. They adjusted their altitude. They circled. And then they made the mistake Elias had anticipated. They lined up the attack in the wrong place, the fake camp. Bombs fell violently, raising dust and destroying everything Elias had built. But there was no one there, no life, nothing but nails, planks, and scraps of materials that he already knew would be sacrificed. Soldiers watched the scene in silence, stunned. The attack that should have destroyed them all landed hundreds of meters away. Elias felt the impact on the ground, but didn't look away. It was definitive proof. His trick wasn't luck. It wasn't coincidence. It was pure logic. It was instinctive engineering. It was art transformed into a weapon. When the last plane retreated, leaving the horizon empty, silence fell over the camp. Soldiers looked at each other, not understanding how they were still alive. Officers tried to rationalize, but Elias knew. He knew exactly what he had done, and he also knew that the enemy wouldn't let it go unpunished. But at that moment, in that instant of silent victory, he realized something even greater. An ordinary man with simple tools had just overcome the greatest technological power of the war, not with force, not with weapons, but with the gift that his whole life forced him to develop. And this trick, this stroke of genius, was only the beginning of the psychological terror he was about to unleash on the heavens. After that second diverted attack, the war changed. Not for everyone. There were still battles, deaths, chaos, pain on every front. But for that camp, for that small piece of land, history took a turn that no one could explain. The soldiers whispered about Elias. Some called him the man of shadows, others the invisible architect. Some believed he had powers. Others said he was just a lucky madman. But the truth is that even Elias didn't fully understand the depth of what he had done. And yet he felt something new inside, a kind of responsibility, not arrogance, not pride, but a silent weight. As if he now carried a flame he couldn't let go out. It was strange. Just a few days before, he was merely a carpenter trying to survive the war. Now, somehow, inexplicably, he was influencing airstrikes by an entire military power. Soldiers began to seek him out more frequently. Some asked him to look at structures, others asked for advice, others simply stayed nearby, as if his presence meant safety. Elias didn't like this. He felt uncomfortable with any idea of a hero. For him, a hero was someone on the front lines carrying the wounded, risking their own life to save another. Him? He was just trying to find logic in the midst of chaos. But the world doesn't always distinguish intention from impact, and while the camp quietly celebrated its survival, something different was happening on the other side of the war. The enemy was beginning to feel fear. Reports began circulating among pilots. The maps didn't match the shadows on the ground. The terrain seemed to move. Landmarks disappeared. What was flat yesterday seemed uneven today. Attack routes became risky. Some pilots swore there was a new type of weapon or technology that changed the terrain overnight. One reported that something on the ground seemed to follow his trajectory. Another said it was impossible to distinguish real shapes from illusions. Confusion spread like a dense, silent, and toxic fog. Experienced pilots began making basic mistakes, misjudging dives, dropping bombs in completely wrong locations, retreating too early. Officials tried to explain, but the more they tried to understand, the more perplexed they became. How could a camp without anti-aircraft defenses possibly hide from the skies? No radar registered anything unusual. No new weapons had been detected. It was as if the Earth had simply decided to defy human logic. With each new attack avoided, the enemy's fear grew. Not the fear of death, but the fear of the unknown. And the unknown is always the most effective. Terror of all. Elias began to notice this indirectly. Every time an enemy pilot made a serious route error, he felt a strange pang in his chest. It wasn't joy, it wasn't satisfaction, it was more like unease, as if he were dealing with something too big, too dangerous. He didn't want to hurt anyone. He didn't want to become responsible for the deaths of pilots who were simply obeying orders. But Elias also knew that if he did nothing, hundreds of soldiers and civilians would continue to die. It was this doubt that consumed him, the moral weight of his invention. And the more he delved into the tricks, the more the camp seemed to depend on him. Officers began calling him into meetings to explain, in military terms, what he was doing. He couldn't explain it. How does one describe intuition? How does one transform years of observation of wood, light, and shadow into technical language? It was impossible. He would only say, "I look, and I see things differently." To some officers, it sounded like pure genius. To others, it seemed like magic. But no one dared stop Elias. He had saved too many lives. Weeks passed, and the phenomenon intensified. Elias began creating new mechanisms, always simple, always made of wood, old metal, ropes, inclined planks, crooked posts, dim lights, carefully placed reflections. He experimented with shapes, angles, and intersecting shadows. He tested positions, modified structures, and walked for hours at night, analyzing how each projection moved with the wind. The harder he worked, the more devastating the psychological impact on the enemy. The pilot's accounts became disturbing. Some said they saw camps disappearing. Others reported giant holes where there was nothing. There were even those who claimed to have seen an invisible barrier, as if the ground were breathing. The human mind doesn't cope well with what it doesn't understand, and those men were panicking. Error rates among pilots increased so much that an enemy colonel wrote, "There are invisible forces at work in that area. Our men return defeated by things they cannot explain." Elias, unknowingly, had become a dark legend in the skies. In the camp, his rise was silent but steady. He didn't dress like an officer. He didn't receive direct orders. He didn't eat with the generals. He continued sleeping in his small makeshift tent, repairing tools, wiping sawdust from his hands, gazing at the fire as if conversing with it. But as soon as he raised his head, soldiers would approach searching for any sign that he would build something new that night, and he would build it. Because now, more than ever, Elias understood that his trick had ceased to be just an absurd idea. It was a real phenomenon. It was psychological. It was strategic. It was terrifying. And the enemy, realizing he was losing control, would do what they always do when they don't understand something. They would try to eliminate it. And that's where the story takes a darker turn, where one man's genius awakens the fury of an entire war machine. When the enemy finally realized that something, or someone, was interfering with the attacks, a silent, almost imperceptible change took over the skies. It was no longer ordinary bombers. It wasn't the repetitive tactical attacks of before. Now it was faster, more precise aircraft, manned by experienced pilots who were only sent in when something truly threatened military strategy. And that threat, though absurd according to their logic, had a name: Elias Marcondes. The first sign that the war was about to tighten its grip came on a cold, windy dawn. The soldiers slept soundly after exhausting days when the sky suddenly turned red like burning embers. They weren't bombs. They were flares. The enemy was marking the territory, trying to identify the exact point where their bombings were failing. That type of action only happened when there was suspicion of a secret weapon, or, in this case, some kind of inexplicable anomaly. Elijah saw it from the door of his tent. The cold wind cut his face, making his eyes water, but it wasn't the wind that unsettled him. It was the recognition. They knew. They didn't know who he was or how he did it, but they knew there was a focus, a center, someone responsible, and that made everything much more dangerous. The next day the bombings returned, but this time they were different, too precise, too targeted. They weren't attacking the entire camp. They were attacking specific area, exactly where Elias worked at night. The first bombs fell so close that the explosion threw him to the ground, sending splinters of wood flying like a rain of blades. He felt the impact on his chest, a sharp pain spreading through his arm. It took him a few seconds to realize he was breathing, still alive, but barely. When he got up, staggering, he saw his work from the previous night destroyed, everything reduced to burnt pieces. It struck his heart more than any explosion could. It wasn't just wood. It was his intelligence, his intuition, his courage, all turned to dust. But there was no time to grieve. Before he could recover, another attack began, lower, more aggressive. It was as if the pilots knew exactly where to aim. And there, in that moment of despair, Elias felt a terrible truth. He had become a target. Soldiers ran towards him, desperate. "Elias, they're aiming at you. Get out of there. They've discovered the trick. Run. Go to the command tent." But Elias didn't run. He stood still, trying to understand how to survive something of that magnitude. The roar of the engines seemed to tear the sky. The smoke from the explosions burned his eyes. He clenched his fists, feeling the earth vibrate beneath his feet. For the first time since it all began, he felt real fear. Not the silent fear of losing lives around him, but the inescapable fear of becoming the next forgotten name in a military report. Still, something inside him didn't break. On the contrary, the danger activated in him the same instinct that had always guided him, to observe, to think, to adjust. The war wanted to crush him, but Elias reacted in a way that only people forged by hard work can react, with focus. That night, even injured, he went back to work. His fingers trembled. He didn't know if from the cold or the trauma. His back ached, as if an iron bar had been pressed against his spine. Still, he continued. He adjusted new boards, tested new angles, created lower and harder to detect structures. Now he wasn't just deceiving pilots, he was deceiving hunters. But the price of greatness came at a toll. Elias began to have deep coughing fits that shook his whole body. Sometimes the blood rushed to his throat. Other times his chest seemed to close up, robbing him of air. He hid this from the soldiers, not because he wanted to appear strong, but because he knew that if anyone suspected his weakness, they wouldn't let him continue. And stopping would mean watching the camp die. The enemy intensified the attacks. They sent ground scouts, they tried to map the terrain. They used spotlights to look for reflections. There were even reports that snipers had been positioned on high points to eliminate any man who approached the suspicious structures. One night, while adjusting a bent wooden plank, Elias heard a hiss, followed by a sharp thud on the log in front of him. A gunshot. The enemy was trying to kill him from a distance. He threw himself to the ground, breathing rapidly, his heart nearly leaping out of his chest. For the first time he understood that he wasn't just facing machines. He was facing men who wanted him dead, men who considered him a real threat, and that hit him with brutal force. Even so, he didn't give up. He worked in secret. He created new visual traps. He deliberately shifted shadows. He dismantled old structures to leave no trace. Each failed enemy attack was a victory, but also a greater risk, because each victory made the enemy try harder to bring down the ghost that lived in the ground. Back at the camp, Elias no longer walked alone. Soldiers kept watch, protecting him as if he were a vital resource. Some accompanied him during the early morning hours, illuminating his path with flickering lanterns, while others mounted clandestine patrols to ward off possible infiltrators. Elias never asked for this, but they knew. They knew that without him, they wouldn't be alive. And then came the most intense night of all. A heavy storm was approaching, bringing thunder that drowned out the sound of engines. The wind scattered dust and ripped tarps from tents. And it was precisely when the storm began that the enemy launched a massive attack, as if they wanted to use the chaos of the weather to mask their final assault. Bombs fell so close that the ground seemed to bend. Shrapnel crisscrossed the air like razors. Elijah's tent was torn, set ablaze, destroyed. He ran, stumbled, fell, got up. His chest burned. He couldn't breathe properly. His eyes burned from the heat of the explosions. And in a moment of utter despair, when it seemed there was no chance left, a soldier pushed him into a trench seconds before a bomb fell where he was. Elias collapsed inside, breathing as if his lungs were on fire. The world spun. Sound faded and returned like waves. And in that instant, Elias realized something he had never admitted, not even to himself. The war wanted to kill him, and she had almost succeeded. But he also realized something else, perhaps the most important thing. As long as he was alive, the war would never be able to understand what he was doing. And that was his advantage. And even broken, wounded, exhausted, and nearing his human limit, Elias knew the climax was approaching. The most brutal attack was yet to come, and it was there that he would leave his final mark on history. The massive attack that night seemed to have drained all the energy from the camp. Soldiers could barely stand. Many coughed from the smoke. Others still trembled from the impact of the explosions. But no one was as exhausted as Elias Marcondes. He remained in the trench until silence returned, sitting, hunched over, breathing heavily, feeling his body still vibrate from the shrapnel that had almost hit him. Every muscle seemed to scream. Every thought seemed too heavy. But amidst all the exhaustion, something inside him was still burning. A small, persistent flame that refused to go out. The following morning, the camp moved slowly, like a wounded organism trying to recover. Officers discussed maps, soldiers collected debris, medics rushed to treat the wounded, and everyone looked at Elias with a mixture of concern and reverence. He walked slowly, resting one hand on his chest, but his eyes scanned the terrain with the same intensity as always. It was as if the war had struck him, but hadn't managed to steal his essence. Elias knew the enemy wouldn't give up. He knew the next attack would be the decisive one. It wouldn't be a bomb dropped haphazardly. It wouldn't be confused pilots. It would be something prepared, something calculated, something destined to destroy not the camp, Buta. Even so, that night, Elijah picked up his tools and went back to work. Soldiers tried to stop them. "Elias, this can't go on. They know where you are. You're sick, man. Look at yourself. At least get some rest for a few hours." But Elias kept walking, silent, as if he had already accepted a destiny greater than himself. His body trembled, he was short of breath, pain throbbed in his bones, but his mind was firm, clear, sharp as a blade. It was the mind of a creator, of someone who understands that when the world crumbles, it is the work of his life that keeps him standing. And that morning, under a heavy, starless sky, Elijah assembled his last work. Nothing there seemed intelligent to anyone who didn't understand what he saw. There were stakes, small signs, leaning planks, stacked logs, calculated reflections with pieces of burnt metal. But for him, it was a map, a message, a visual trap so perfect it could confuse even the most trained eyes. He created false trails of shadows, drew non-existent reference points with light, tilted posts to suggest depth where the terrain was flat. It was like assembling an invisible puzzle that only made sense when viewed from the sky. When it was over, Elias could barely stand. And then came the final attack. The fight. Sound of the engines was different this time. Deeper, heavier, more decisive. These weren't ordinary bombers. They were specialized aircraft, elite pilots, men sent with a single mission to eliminate the anomaly in that sector. Above the clouds they came with everything they had. The entire war seemed concentrated in that single attack. The entire camp held its breath. Elias stood beside the soldiers, not because he wanted to witness their work, but because he knew that if something went wrong, there would be no time to run. He breathed deeply, trying to ignore the pain that pierced his chest like a knife, trying to keep his eyes open while his body begged for rest. The planes began to descend, aligning ourselves, looking for landmarks, and then they found exactly what Elijah wanted them to find: false shadows, deceptive reflections, non-existent depth, the illusory terrain. The pilots descended too low. They adjusted their altitude in the wrong direction. They mistook the false camp for the real one. And when they dropped the bombs, everything fell into the void, in a completely uninhabited area, kilometers away from the actual camp. It was the most expensive, most calculated, most aggressive attack, and also the enemy's greatest failure in that sector of the war. Elias, seeing this happen, let out a breath as if finally releasing a weight he had carried for weeks. He stood there, motionless, giving a small, tired smile, not of victory, but of relief, of duty fulfilled, of total surrender. After that day, the camp never again suffered direct air attacks. The enemy concluded that that sector wasn't worth the risk, and so hundreds, perhaps thousands, of lives were saved because of a man who never asked to be there. In the following days, officials wanted to record the feat, promote Elias and turn his story into military propaganda, but he refused everything. He didn't want his name in reports. He didn't want a medal. He didn't want glory. When the war finally subsided, Elias packed his few belongings, his tools, a notebook full of scribbled notes, a few pieces of wood that remained intact, and returned to his simple life. The destroyed village needed to be rebuilt. Tables needed new legs, doors needed hinges, children needed chairs, and Elias returned to being what he had always been, a man of wood, of silence, of work. No one who saw him at the end of his life would have guessed that he had single-handedly defied the logic of an entire air force. But those who lived through that time knew. They whispered his story as if it were legend, and perhaps it was. Because in the end, Elias's legacy wasn't the trick. It wasn't the strategy. It wasn't the invisible engineering. It was proof that, sometimes, an ordinary man with a simple talent can face the impossible and win. What did you learn from the story of Elias, a simple carpenter who turned the tide against an entire air raid using only what he knew best? If any part of this journey resonated with you, comment below what it was. I'd love to know what stayed with you after reading this. And since this story resonated with you, please like and subscribe to the channel so that more people can also discover these inspiring and surprising narratives that make us see the impossible in a new light. The next video is already on its way, and you can bet it will captivate you even more.